Mysteries await just a page away. Ready to dive in? Welcome to The Book Reader, where stories unfold one enchanting page at a time. Subscribe now and unlock the magic.
Richard Branson. Losing My Virginity, the autobiography. Chapter 1. 2. You will either go to prison or become a millionaire. 1963, 1967. After the crammer had served its purpose by beating me into shape, I moved to Stowe, a big public school in Buckinghamshire for over 800 boys. There I faced a daunting prospect. Fagging was still in place. This was an archaic practice in which the younger boys were expected to run errands and do minor chores for the older ones. In effect, to be their servants. Bullying was rife. Your reputation and ability to avoid being picked on was helped enormously by being able to score a goal or hit a six. But I couldn't play any games as my knee buckled whenever I tried to run. Since I was also unable to cope with the academic work, I was very quickly sidelined. Being out of the sports teams and bottom of the class was an unenviable position. It seemed as if all the challenges my parents had set me were now irrelevant. I found refuge in the library, where I went every afternoon and started writing a novel. I sat in the most wonderful splendor, surrounded by leather-bound books and two globes, overlooking the ornamental lake into which the last head boy had dived and never surfaced. I wrote the most lurid sexual fantasies I could conjure up, amazing erotic stories all about a young boy who couldn't play sports due to a knee injury, but who was befriended and then gloriously and expertly seduced by the young Scandinavian school matron. In my mind's eye, she used to creep up behind him when he was working in the library. But sadly for me, no matter what incredible sexual encounters I dreamt up, there wasn't a girl, let alone a Scandinavian, within miles of Stowe, and matron was 60 years old. As I sat in the library panting at my own prose, and scribbling faster and faster, I became aware of another regular visitor to the library, Jonathan Hollingems. In comparison with most of the boys at Stowe, Johnny was extremely worldly and sophisticated, widely read and staggeringly knowledgeable about the arts. He came from London, where his parents knew journalists and writers. When Johnny read private eye, he knew half the people mentioned in it. His mother was a successful playwright. It was through Johnny that my interest in the world of newspapers began to grow, and I began to think that I would like to be a journalist. Halfway through the term, I read a school announcement about an essay competition called the Junior Gavin Maxwell Prize, which had been set up by the author, an old boy from Stowe. I momentarily put aside my pulsating pornography and wrote a short story which won the prize. The complete absence of competition must have helped. Gavin Maxwell, the author of Ring of Bright Water, came to present the prize at Stowe. He arrived with Gavin Young, the Observer's war correspondent, and later the author of Slow Boat to China. After the ceremony, they drove back to Surrey and dropped me off at Shamley Green. I stayed in touch with them. They were very supportive of me, partly I think, because they fancied me. But once they realized I wasn't that way inclined, they still remained good and helpful friends. After winning the prize, my English began to improve, and I soared up the class to 3rd out of 21. I was still 18th in Latin and bottom in maths, physics, and chemistry. He tries hard but has very great difficulty in understanding even the simplest mathematical process, and in retaining any new topic covered. Read one end-of-term report. One Easter holiday, I decided to follow my mother's example and make some money. Undeterred by the school's lack of faith in my ability with numbers, I saw an opportunity to grow Christmas trees. We had just moved house from one side of Shamley Green to the other, from East's cottage to Tanyard's farm, which was a rambling building with many barns and sheds and some land. I went round to talk Nick into the plan. He was also on holiday from his school, which was at Ampleforth in Yorkshire. We would plant 400 Christmas trees in the field at Tanyard's farm. By the Christmas after next, they would have grown to at least 4 feet, and we would be able to sell them. Nick and I agreed to do the work together and share the profits equally. That Easter we furrowed the ground and planted the 400 seedlings in the field above Tanyard's farm. We worked out that, if they all grew to 6 feet, we would make £2 a tree, creating a grand total of £800, compared with our initial investment of just £5 for the seedlings. In the following summer holiday, we went to investigate the trees. There were 1 or 2 tiny sprigs above ground, but the rest had been eaten by rabbits. We exacted dire revenge and shot and skinned a lot of rabbits. We sold them to the local butcher for £1 each, but it wasn't quite the £800 we had planned. The following Christmas, Nick's brother was given a budgerigar as a present. This gave me the idea for another great business opportunity: breeding budgies. For a start, I reasoned, I could sell them all year round, rather than just during the fortnight before Christmas. I worked out the prices and made some calculations about how fast they could breed and how cheap their food was, and persuaded my father to build a huge aviary. In my last week at school, I wrote to Dad and explained the financial implications. So few days now until the holidays. Have you ordered any material we might want for our giant budgerigar cage? I thought our best bet to get the budgerigars at reduced rate would be from Julian Carlian. I feel that if the shops sold them for 30 sh, he would get say 17 sh, and we could buy them off him for 18 or 19 sh, which would give him a profit and save us the odd 10 sh per bird. How about it? My father reluctantly built the aviary, and the birds bred rapidly. However, I had overestimated the local demand for budgies. Even after everyone in Shamley Green had bought at least 2, we were still left with an aviary full of them. One day at school, I got a letter from my mother breaking the bad news that the aviary had been invaded by rats which had eaten the budgies. It was only many years later that she confessed she had been fed up with cleaning out the aviary, so one day had left the cage door open, and they all escaped. She didn't try too hard to recapture them. But while neither of these schemes had the effect of making money, they did teach me something about maths. I found that it was only when I was using real numbers to solve real problems that maths made any sense to me. If I was calculating how much a Christmas tree would grow, or how many budgies would breed, the numbers then became real, and I enjoyed using them. Inside the classroom, I was still a complete dunce at maths. I once did an IQ test in which the questions just seemed absurd. I couldn't focus on any of the mathematical problems, and I think that I scored about 0. I worry about all the people who have been classified as stupid by these kinds of tests. Little do they know that often these IQ tests have been dreamt up by academics who are absolutely useless at dealing with the practicalities of the outside world. I loved doing real business plans, even if the rabbits did get the better of me. I think my parents must have instilled a rebellious streak in me. I have always thought rules were there to be broken, and Stowe had as many rules and regulations as the army. Many of them, it seemed to Johnny Gems and me, completely anachronistic and pointless. There was the outmoded practice of faggying for one thing. Then there was the CCF, in which boys dressed up as soldiers and paraded around with antiquated rifles, and compulsory church attendance on Sundays. I managed to dodge the latter by skipping the first service of the new term. My name was left off the register, and I was never missed from then on. During January and February 1966, Johnny and I began to talk about how to change the school rules. We were 15 years old, but we believed that we could make a difference. My parents had brought me up to think that we could all change the world. So when I looked at how Stowe was run, I felt sure that I could do it better. Stowe was actually reasonably liberal in encouraging boys of all ages to contribute to the running of the school. Johnny and I were particularly incensed by the rule that anyone who wasn't playing games had to go and watch the school team when they were playing another school. Although we were able to go to the library during weekday afternoons, we were still forced to watch the school teams play most Saturdays. I knew that if I hadn't been ruled out by my weak knee, I would be in the teams, so I felt doubly frustrated. I wrote to the headmaster. I am against the utter waste of time that is spent in compulsory watching of matches. If one is unable to play for the first 11, one should be able to spend one's time in better ways than that. I know this sounds a frightful break against tradition, etc., but I feel very strongly about this. If 450-odd people watching matches spent that time in Buckingham cleaning windows, for instance, they would gain at least something more than watching others achieving something. I also tried to reorganize the system of school meals. I feel that to improve Stowe, one has first got to do it socially, even before religiously. There are many boys who are thirsting for knowledge through interesting conversations. One of the best times to talk is at meals, but at Stowe this is practically impossible. One goes into hall, sits down at one's allotted table next to the same boys every day. A canteen must be constructed in one of the dining rooms. Then boys could choose their own food. They would be free to sit down where they wish, and they could put their forks and plates in a box when they go out. The food waste at the moment is fantastic, and with a canteen system, you could cut down on at least half the Italian and Spanish waiters. I would be very interested in your views on this, and any money saved could possibly be put towards my next plan. And I went on to explore the idea of a sixth form bar. The headmaster suggested that I air my views in the school magazine, but Johnny and I wanted to set up an alternative magazine with a fresh attitude. We wanted to campaign against fagging, corporal punishment, and compulsory chapel, games, and Latin. All these ideas were far too revolutionary to be aired in the school magazine, The Stoic, a name which seemed only too apt to its long-suffering readers. We then thought about linking up with other schools that had similar rules. Gradually the idea of an interschool magazine was hatched. We would link up with other schools and swap ideas. I jotted down a few titles in a school notebook. Today, 1966, Focus, Modern Britain, and Interview. Then I wrote out what I wanted to publish, and did some more sums in which, once again, I enjoyed thinking about the implications of the maths. I wrote out a list of 250 MPs, whom I found in Who's Who, and a list of possible advertisers whom I found by going through the telephone book. I also wrote to W.H. Smith asking whether they would be prepared to stock the magazine. Thus, with contributors, advertisers, distributors, and costs all in place, at least on paper, I had written my first business plan. The numbers looked too small to work, so Johnny and I decided to involve more schools and technical colleges and universities. It would open up the magazine to more people and encourage advertisers. We thought that if we aimed the magazine at university students, then sixth formers would buy it. But if we published a magazine for sixth formers, then students wouldn't be interested. We settled on the name Student, which seemed a good one since at the time there was a great deal of talk about student power. This was the period of student sit-ins, occupations, and demos at universities and polytechnics. It was an exciting time to be young. My mother lent me £4 as a float against the cost of telephone calls and letters, and Johnny's father arranged for headed notepaper with Student, the magazine for Britain's youth, printed across the top with the symbol of a rising sun. We set to work writing to all the contributors and possible advertisers. Student was a perfect vehicle. It gave us a new lease of life. There was so much to organize. I began to set up an office in my study at school and asked the headmaster for a telephone in my room. He unsurprisingly refused. As a result, I had to make telephone calls from a call box. But I quickly discovered a useful trick. If I called up the operator and told her that the machine had taken my money, but my call had been disconnected, I was able to get a free call. As well as a free call, I was able to avoid the telltale pip 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 as the coins went in. Better still, the operator sounded like a secretary. "I have Mr. Branson for you." I drew up lists and lists of people to call, and slowly worked my way down them. Most of them rejected the idea of paying for advertising in an unpublished magazine. But gradually I began to find ways of attracting their attention. I would call up National Westminster Bank and tell them that Lloyd's Bank had just taken out a full-page advertisement. Would they like to advertise alongside Lloyd's Bank? Student would be Britain's biggest magazine for young people, I added. I called up Coca-Cola and told them that Pepsi had just booked a big advertisement, but that the back page was still free. I called up the Daily Telegraph and asked them whether they would prefer to advertise before or after the Daily Express. Another tack was to ask an innocuous question that they couldn't easily deny. Are you interested in recruiting the highest caliber school leavers and university graduates? No personnel manager would ever admit that they were looking for mediocre recruits. Then we're publishing just the magazine for you. In order to avoid the operator coming back on the line to cut me off, I learned how to pack all this into 5 minutes. I started speaking faster and pushing harder. My voice had broken early, and nobody guessed that they were talking to a 15-year-old schoolboy standing in a public telephone box. I gave my address at Shamley Green, and when I sent out letters I wrote them by the dozen and posted them to my parents, who in turn asked Elizabeth, an old friend in the village, to type them. My schoolwork was going from bad to worse, but I was giving myself a wonderful lesson in confidence building. Had I been 5 or 6 years older, the sheer absurdity of trying to sell advertising to major companies in a magazine that did not yet exist, edited by 2 15-year-old schoolboys, would have prevented me from picking up the phone at all. But I was too young to contemplate failure. During the holidays I told Nick all about Student. He was equally excited and agreed to help distribute it in Ampleforth. He would also try to find contributors for it. Nick recognized that Student was really my and Johnny's creation, so he stood back a little bit, but he was as enthusiastic as we were about its potential. We were 15 years old and felt we could do anything. By April 1966, and the run-up to O-levels, I was able to drop a number of subjects that I had no chance of passing and put even more time into Student. To my relief and that of my Latin and science teachers, we went our separate ways. He is a very weak candidate indeed at Latin, and he has now given it up, and his interest in science was obviously minimal. Although I am far from convinced that he could not have done better than he did, it was quite evident that he was never going to make much progress. I was doing better at history, French and English, but not at maths, which was compulsory. In spite of much apparent effort, he is finding difficulty in retaining methods of attack on problems from one week to the next. He will need a lot of luck with the questions in July. However, the main excitement in my life was writing the hundreds of letters which I started sending out from Stowe, and waiting on tenterhooks for the answers. For all my enthusiasm and newfound guile, it took a long time to find any advertisers willing to commit themselves to taking space in Student. Johnny and I sent letters out all summer term, continued in the holidays, and through the following autumn term. By April 1967, With my single ancient history A-level looming in the summer, we were still no nearer pulling a magazine together. Johnny and I had been working on Student for over a year, and all we had to show for it were dozens of letters of support from various headmasters and teachers, and various vague promises to contribute from politicians, but no advertisements or hard copy. I refused to bow to the inevitable. My letter home dated April 27, 1967 apologized for the small amount of time I had spent with my family over Easter. It was a wonderful holiday these last 4 weeks, and more was achieved than ever before. I only hope you do not feel too annoyed with me for not being home longer, and for not making the time to do more in the garden. I possibly wrongly see a divided duty, one to my home, and one to Student. It is a difficult decision. Anything I do in life I want to do well and not half-heartedly. I feel I am doing my best in Student, as well as the time allows. Yet that leaves little time for my other duty. To me, I saw a danger of falling between two stools, and still do. Of being a failure in everything I had, and having to search for priorities, if I am to get anywhere. I am also still only 16. Although it sounds a terribly thing to say, and I only say it in defense. What do most 16-year-olds do? No one I know here did anything more last holidays than I used to do 2 or 3 years ago. Flicks in the evening, mucking about during the day. What did you do when you were a boy of 16? Shoot, fish, swim, go out with girls on one side, and possibly your museum, and helping around the garden on the other side. You had time to help around the garden. You did not see the world as it is today when you were 16. Your career was almost lined up. Today it is one long struggle. You say Student is selfish and self-centered of me. Possibly, I say. But is it any more selfish than anything else one does in life? It is, in my opinion, a career like anything else. It could benefit many more people than going to the films, etc. It is a beginning to my life like university, or your finals were to yours. It might sound really foul of me bringing this up in my first letter, but I've had little else on my mind over the last 2 weeks, and felt it made sense to get it down on paper. I was lucky. I always felt that I could speak to my parents as if they were my closest friends. Rather than closing down on me, they reacted very well to this letter, and we kept open our lines of communication. At about this time I noticed that a good many of my friends stopped confiding in their parents, but I never felt embarrassed or rebellious towards mine. They always encouraged me to go ahead and do whatever I wanted to do, and if they did not always praise my projects, they never expressed less than sympathy and support. The last thing my father wanted to do was to spend his weekends building a cage for my budgerigars, but he never told me. My mother was extremely keen to help me with Student, and wrote articles, gave me pocket money that she could scarcely spare, and thought of people whom I should approach. Once when I told her that I wanted to get in touch with David Frost, she spent weeks asking all her friends whether they knew anyone who knew David Frost. Then we had our first breakthroughs. We received our first hard copy, a £250 check for an advertisement, and Gerald Scarfe agreed to draw a cartoon for us and be interviewed. Student was finally changing from a gleam in my mind's eye to a real magazine. The other thing that changed from a bright gleam to a reality was sex. I had a number of girlfriends during the holidays and came tantalizingly closer and closer to losing my virginity at parties, when the lights went out and everyone lay around on cushions. I finally found a girl who was reputed to go the whole way, and at one party we slipped upstairs into a remote bedroom. I was amazed when she let me push up her skirt and take off her knickers. As we began to make love, she started to moan and groan. She was clearly having a very erotic time. I was pretty pleased by how well I must be performing since she was panting, and tossing her head from side to side as she fought to control her breathing. I put up a great show and finally came with equally impressive gusto, roaring and shouting and huffing and puffing. Then I rolled off her. To my astonishment, she carried on panting, apparently having what I took to be ecstatic multiple orgasms. Just as I was beginning to feel a little bemused and somewhat redundant, I finally realized that she was panting for a reason. Asthma, shahized in breathless panic. Inhaler. Ambulance. Happily, my first steady girlfriend was healthy and Dutch. Rudy was a Dutch revolutionary, and in my last term I invited her to Stowe. She slipped into the school grounds and secretly pitched her tent in the middle of the wood. For one glorious week, I crept out every night and walked past the lake to the woods where Rudy would be smoking pot and cooking over a tin stove. We lay out under the stars and talked about what we would do to change the world. Rudy was passionately interested in world politics. She became students' grandly titled Dutch overseas correspondent and went on to write some powerful pieces about the Baader Meinhof terrorist gang. After dropping all subjects except ancient history, I had even more time for Student Magazine. Soon Johnny and I were regularly taking the train to London to interview people. However, I had to take my A-level, and I was having difficulty remembering facts that struck me as meaningless and abstract. I had bought some fact file cards on ancient history, which contained all the necessary information about Greece and Rome. In preparation for the exam, I cut the edges off these and put them in various pockets, even sliding one under my watch strap. When I looked at the questions in the exam, the most difficult thing was remembering which pocket the relevant facts were in. Then I pulled the card out of my pocket and held it curled in the palm of my left hand as I wrote with my right. As it happened, I was too preoccupied with student to care about what grade I achieved. I was just intent on leaving Stowe as quickly as possible and starting life as a journalist in London. When I left Stowe in 1967, aged almost 17, my headmaster's parting words to me were, "Congratulations, Branson. I predict that you will either go to prison or become a millionaire." The next and final time I heard from Stowe was 6 months later in a letter from the headmaster dated January 16, 1968. Dear Branson, I have been pleased to see that the press have given you a good send-off, and I was very interested to see a copy of your first issue. May I send you congratulations and all good wishes for the future. Yours are Drayson. The first issue of Student was published in January 1968.
And that marks the end of the current chapter. Thank you for listening to The Book Reader. Stay tuned for the next episode tomorrow. Please subscribe for updates.